Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never practice nunchucks in a crowded room. Never eat chole before a road trip. Always take your shirt off before you iron it. Don't take a call near a swimming pool. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Many of you must be familiar with this series I do, an occasional series called First Person Second Draft. That is when something happens and something brings back to life an old story, an old event, an old phenomenon I might have covered, I might have interacted with as a journalist, particularly in my years as a reporter, which I talk about now with current knowledge. That is First Person Second Draft. So in that series, this is a new edition, and this is a new edition in a sad setting, because this is about an old friend of mine who passed away, Khaled Ahmed, the noted Pakistani journalist, linguist, intellectual, author, and also one of the most wonderful people I have known. He's mourned in the entire subcontinent and also by his fans in academia, and he's mourned by fellow journalists and his many admirers in think tank circles in the subcontinent, but also across the world in the same communities that deal with the subcontinent's politics, culture, and strategic issues. So here is Khaled Ahmed. Khaled Ahmed's death from cancer at 81 is a loss not just for Pakistan, but for the entire subcontinent. He was the rare editor, author, linguist, newsroom mentor, most important, and no pretenses, no qualifications, secular liberal that our region's public debate finds only a couple of times in an entire generation. And I say that with great seriousness. If you argued or disagreed with him as an Indian on an issue, for example, he will never try to close the argument or shut you up with a dismissive, "But what about Kashmir?" or some version of it. Khaled's work has been immortalized on World Wide Web and in at least 8 books, the jackets of which you see on your screens. And through thousands of columns in English and Urdu, prove was beyond anything petty or divisive. Never the word "what about" for him, no whataboutery. Some of his most invaluable and much underappreciated work lies in his columns, where he traced the common origin of words in different languages. Check out his Word for Word, it's a book, wonderful book. Word for Word, Stories Behind Everyday Words We Use. This was published by Oxford University Press. I checked out, it's now a rare book available at a very high price, but you will find it in some library, or maybe you can find a soft copy on internet. Knowing Khaled closely as a friend and sometimes sparring partner, because we also had disagreements, particularly in conferences, this was an honor. He was the wisest Pakistani I knew or probably existed, as his many fans also would agree. That's why this loss is also personal. Getting to know Khaled was one of those coincidences you can write about in your memoirs or occasional writings. Like this episode of my First Person Second Draft, you will also find a text with the description of this video. In early September 1984, 40 years ago, in early September 1984, I saw the swarthy, Pathanish-looking man in a Khaddar Salwar Kameez in the elevator of what used to be the Boston Park Plaza Hotel. We introduced ourselves. He was the first Pakistani I had ever met, the first Pakistani. He was considerably older, having spent time in the Foreign Service, Pakistani Foreign Service, which he so detested that later, when he wrote a weekly column for us, he forbade us from mentioning the fact that he had served in the Foreign Service, including, in fact, in the Pakistani embassy in Moscow in early 70s. When we met, he was already in a senior position with the Pakistan Times. We were together with the multinational group of fellows, I think about 12 or 14, at Fletcher School for a week, and then dispersed to the newspapers we were individually assigned to for 4 weeks each. Khaled went to Christian Science Monitor. My destination was the New York Times. We had both arrived the previous evening from our respective countries, jet lagged, changing flights from New York, jet lagged, but wide awake at around 6 a.m. Boston time. I was a new running enthusiast and was headed for the big park. Khaled joined me for a walk, somewhat reluctantly. He'd rather lounge over coffee and read the morning's Boston Globe. He knew way more about the world than I did then. We talked about corruption, misgovernance, and injustices in our countries. Instinctively, I said, what to do? All our politicians are so corrupt. That was when I figured how different a mind Khalid's was. गलत कह रहे हो दोस्त, you've got it wrong, my friend. He said, हमारे अवाम करप्ट हैं, हुक्मरान नहीं. Our people are corrupt, not our leaders. I found it cynical then, even ascribed it to the frustrations of a Pakistani living under dictatorships or serial dictatorships. It was, by the way, in 84, was Zia's heyday. As I saw more in life, however, I understood what he had meant. 100 times I saw something as a journalist, people voting for freebies, for being allowed to pay no tax. Occupy toll plaza is now a pastime in some regions, particularly Punjab. Seeking favors for a fee, even cursing politicians who set up systems so good you can no longer game them or get your way around them through grease or speed money. It is now that I understood what he had meant. If the people are transactional, if the people are your customers, politicians are only responding to market forces, so don't blame them. Khaled's was the only contact number I had on my first visit to Pakistan the very next summer, 1985. My visa had been granted primarily to cover the trial of Sikh hijackers of an Indian Airlines plane to Lahore. He and his then wife, the brilliant psychoanalyst Dr. Durre Samin Ahmed, came to see me in the evening at what was then called the Avari Hilton. You pack your bag, dost, and move to our home, Khalid said, warning me that just the hotel room will eat up most of my per diem. Those days, RBI used to sanction very tight per diems for you. Plus, he said, they'd love to have me with them. Their marriage was already fraying, but enduring friendships grew with both of them in the following decades. My visits as a reporter to Pakistan then became frequent, as did Khalid's to India, mostly for conferences. That was also the track 2 era. How sharp was his eye? On his first visit to India, at least since I had known him, he noted Durga Puja processions and some pandals. It is when I was driving him to my home, then in Saket, the southernmost corner of Delhi. He said, watch this Shera Wali Mata, goddess who rides a tiger, Shera Wali Mata phenomenon closely. Your Hinduism is changing. It will become more political, not exactly militant or doctrinaire like our Islam, but more nationalistic, angrier, less forgiving. This was Khalid's reading of India's evolving politics in 1986. In a subsequent conversation several years later, he asked me if I was aware of the phenomenon of Dr. Zakir Naik in India. He was surprised that I had zero idea. गलती कर रहे हो, जाके देखो उसके video. You are erring in not knowing about him. Go watch his videos, he said. Nayak, he said, had already risen as the most powerful and popular Islamic tele-evangelist, not just in the subcontinent, but in all of Asia. It was a matter of time, he said, that he will be a global phenomenon and a dangerous one. Even more dangerous, he said, because he spoke in English, wore a tie, and was masterful in sugarcoating his most toxic ideas, always delivered with a smile. We saw that in Nayak's recent visit to Pakistan as well, when the only time he frowned was while complaining about PIA charging him for his 50 or whatever number of suitcases. In fact, even when he humiliated a young woman asking him questions about pedophilia, etc., he had a smile and a smirk, not a frown. The only time he frowned was while complaining about PIA, and on that maybe anybody can complain about PIA with a frown. I was curious, partly because Khalid had alerted me. I was curious and found Zakir Naik on my Walk the Talk in the course of time, I think towards 2010 sometime, and must admit that he was too smooth for me to pin down. He tailored his message depending on the audience, one version for the faithful, another for the journalist, and a special one for a journalist. Keep close track of him. Khaled had said he will only bring more conservatism and misery to Muslims across the world, especially in the subcontinent, and he will unleash many dangerous forces we can't even imagine today. This when no one in India had seen Naik that way. That is how sharp and prescient Khalid was. Of course, the only thing Khalid did not understand was money. As one of Pakistan's three illustrious cousins, with Majid Khan, former cricket captain, and Imran Khan, Khalid owned one of the three large houses, big old style bungalows in Lahore's leafy Zaman Park. But the only notable thing about his home was its size, the books, and the chaos. And money, when I persuaded him to start writing a column for us at the Indian Express, he said he will do it, but only if I offered him 25,000 Pakistani rupees per column. He thought that'll fob me off. That'll make me scoot, as he never wanted more work of any kind. I told him he was nuts, that Pakistani currency was declining rapidly, that he should sign his contract in dollars. He should insist on being signed up in dollars instead at $300 per column, which is what we offered him then, which was about the equivalent of Pakistani rupees 25,000. Of course, RBI permitting. If he was still writing that column at 25,000 Pakistani rupees as he had wanted, it would be less than $100 now. That's how little he knew about money. The Pakistani establishment was always confused about him. Forget being abusive, controversial, or rebellious, he was hardly ever even a little bit risque, even when at a higher than usual spiritual level. You know what I mean. If you check out his archive, he was the master of that rapidly dying art of subtlety. He delivered the toughest message in language even nobody in Pakistan could launch an FIR on. He left the establishment bemused. They detested his views, but would still invite him to speak at their most prestigious academies. Khaled led many newspapers. After Pakistan Times, he held key positions at The Nation, The Frontier Post, and then Newsweek Pakistan, which is where we last met in the summer of 2014 when I was speaking at the Lahore Literary Festival. I could already see that he was mentoring a new young crop of Pakistani journalists, modern, professional, curious, and proud to be working for him. Khaled always had a youthful fan club follow him. Khaled never wrote a news story or gave you one. He wrote opinion, but never wrote a news story, never broke a news story or gave you one. But he always had a nugget. Like, for example, the fact that the 1993 Bombay blasts were organized through Dawood Ibrahim by an ISI brigadier, by an in-service ISI brigadier. He gave me the name also. And while it wasn't a rogue operation, it was done in a way to create deniability. Much of the money, he said, had been raised by holding fashion and film star nights in Dubai using Indian stars through the D gang. And that money was then used by him and ISI to finance that operation, that serial bombing operation in Bombay. Khalid saw the rise of the Lashkars, the Kalashnikov culture, and jihadism much earlier than most. He nudged me to go and meet Qazi Hussain Ahmed, then Jamaat-e-Islami chief in Pakistan, and a very then militant-sounding Maulana called Tahirul Qadri. See the Kalashnikovs around them. See the ease with which they carry these Kalashnikovs. Hear the slogans, the speeches. You would know what this phenomenon is, and you would know what is coming, he would say. On two occasions, Arun Puri, India Today editor-in-chief, and I travelled together to Pakistan. The first time, Arun joined me in August 1988 when I was a reporter and covering Ziaul Haq's death. The second was during the 2013 Pakistan general elections when we decided to travel together, though we worked in different publications. In 1988, Khalid told us Zia is gone, but Ziaism will endure. He then explained to us what Ziaism is. This is what ultimately morphed into the ISI as a state within the state within the state, because if Pakistani army is a state within the state, then ISI is a state within the Pakistani army. And then with the Lashkars that this phenomenon bred, they are all carrying forward the torch of Ziaism. The second time in 2013 at the Newsweek Pakistan office, Khalid told us the scary story of how Lashkar-e-Toiba had become furious over his writings. a common friend and well-wisher approached him, urging him to meet Hafiz Saeed, LET chief, and make it up to him, which Khalid said he did. He said, "Jaan sabko pyari hoti hai. Everybody loves his life." The LET chief told him he respected him for his intellect, but some of his writings and sayings and his speech were unacceptable. Khalid recounted deadpan that he touched Saeed's feet in apology and came back chastened and alive. Arun Puri, in fact, mentioned this in the article he wrote in India Today upon his return. Looking at Khalid, you would never know how well connected he was, and I'm not just talking about his illustrious cousins. He turned up to work in crumpled track pants and t-shirt, which he had most likely fallen asleep in the previous night. His owners sometimes stalked him and shooed visitors like me away so he could finish that one brilliant article or editorial. At the Frontier Post, the owner's brother actually sat on the peon's stool, the stainless steel peon's stool outside Khalid's office door to make sure he won't be distracted. Bina Sarwar, who worked for him then and now runs Sapan Collective, seeking to heal wounds in the subcontinent, might remember some of this. And if Khalid was in a generous mood for a real meal and an expansive gupshup session, he would take me to Lahore's Lakshmi Chowk and its endless street of takatak kebab shops. Takatak because that's the sound they make on the big skillet or tawa while tossing brain, kidney and more exotic organs of the goat's body. He was at the Frontier Post in the summer of 1990 when it looked like India and Pakistan were about to go to war at any time. That's when Benazir Bhutto had delivered her jug jug mo mo hun hun speech, making chopping motions from one arm on the other, threatening to cut then Governor Jagmohan into pieces. In the lead up to that situation before I came to Pakistan, we had written a customary cover story on military balance between the two countries, etc. And just for a lark, I had invited military analyst Ravi Rekhe to collaborate with me to calculate the cost of a 1,000-hour war. Why a 1,000-hour war, you might ask? That's because Benazir Bhutto had repeated her father's boast of a 1,000-year war on India, and VP Singh, then Prime Minister, had dismissed it contemptuously in Parliament, saying those who talk of 1,000-year wars should see if they will last 1,000 hours. A quick calculation showed 1,000 hours are about 42 days, in fact something like 41.667 days. And longer than both our wars together, 1965 22 days and 1971 13 days, so total of 35 days. This 1,000 hours was going to be nearly 42 days. Our proposition was, what if we fight a 1,000-hour war and win? What will be the cost and what will happen if we win? Of course, the editorial message was more complex. That wars don't solve anything, they are frightfully expensive, and if anything, they worsen the problem even if you win one decisively. Evidence was India's victory in 1971 and how just 2 decades later we were set for war yet again. That means it did not buy us permanent peace. It was, if anything, that article, if anything, was a pacifist argument, and it was illustrated with that familiar picture of Lieutenant General A.K. Niazi signing the instrument of surrender in Dhaka. See that on your screens. I was carrying a copy of that India Today issue and left it on Khalid's desk. Khalid liked the argument very much, and the Frontier Post republished a facsimile of the article. And while the article may have underlined the futility of another war, the picture lit a fire. The Pakistani GHQ was on the line to Khalid and his owners with the direst threats. How could a Pakistani paper publish that picture? Khalid saying it was just the facsimile of India Today's page did not cut. There were multiple apologies, including on the paper's front page the next day, and as you would expect, those apologies mostly began with, "We hold Pakistan's armed forces in the highest regard," etc., etc., etc. Of course, a day later, the paper published a main edit page article by a retired air marshal gaming the coming war on D+1, which is the military speak for first day of the war, or D+1. D is a D-Day, like the D-Day. On D+1, the Indian Navy is sunk, fully sunk, nothing is left of it. By D+2, its air force is shot out of the skies, and by D+4, fourth day of the war, Pakistani armor has reached Jaipur. India has stood for peace and agreed to be divided in manageable units. I was astounded and shocked, if not a bit amused, and walked up to Khaled's office again. How can you publish such crap? I asked. ये सब ऊपर से आता है. All this stuff comes from the top, he said, and then explained with great irony and delight how the air marshal would have been besieged with phone calls since the morning from all and sundry saying, Sir, आज तो आपने कमाल कर दिया. इंडिया को पूरी शिकस्त, चारों खाने चित. How brilliantly you've totally vanquished and destroyed India. It's a mindset, he said, that the powers that be employ the useful idiots in the veterans community to fuel. And you in India should watch out, for this might be growing there as well. It's inevitable. Was he prophetic? I leave it to you to judge. He was just wise, very wise. And I'd say with trepidation, for it might anger some people or trigger some people, that's the modern language, including friends, and put their backs up. But Khaled was the rare, genuinely secular agnostic, maybe even atheist, definitely the only such I have met among my many Muslim friends who are not leftists, because he was no leftist either, not even by a long shot. If anything, his time in Moscow in the Soviet era had made him wise to the communism's fallacies and follies. One of the arguments, in fact, he often made was that there was no word for secular in Urdu or Arabic. There was no equivalent or no place for secular in Urdu or Arabic. The conclusion was obvious. It is said of generals that they don't die, they just fade away. In Pakistan, that may not often apply because generals don't fade away even if they die. Think of Zia-ul Haq. Died but never faded away. Ziaism still endures. But journalists usually die unsung, the best being a memorial at the press club or some such. That's why we must remember and celebrate Khaled Ahmed's life and contribution. That's why he's such a loss to journalism and the public debate in the subcontinent. I feel blessed that he was the first Pakistani I met, and our friendship lasted 4 decades until cancer took Khaled away.